To wrestling fans, Paul Orndorff was simply Mr. Wonderful, but behind the fame was a heartbreaking decline that few people truly understood. Now, the WWE legends who knew him best are finally opening up his tragic life.
He's really in bad shape, physically. He's not the Paul Orndorff that you would, that 260, 270-pound guy. He's like 200 pounds. 215.
One story will change everything you thought you knew about Mr. Wonderful. Let me break it down. The man behind Mr. Wonderful. Paul Orndorff was born in 1949 and grew up in Brandon, Florida. Before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring, he was a football player. He played fullback and tight end at the University of Tampa, where he was later put into the school's Athletic Hall of Fame, and he was drafted into the NFL by the New Orleans Saints. The football career did not last. By 1976, he had switched to professional wrestling, and that is where he stayed for the next 24 years. His first years were spent in the National Wrestling Alliance territories. The regional companies that ran the business before one or two promotions took over the whole country. In Memphis, he feuded with Jerry Lawler and won the NWA Southern Heavyweight title. In Georgia and Atlanta, he held the NWA National Heavyweight Championship more than once. He teamed with Jimmy Snuka, worked through the Southeast, and toured Japan. By the end of this run, he was a main event name in the territory system. In late 1983, he joined the World Wrestling Federation. The company now called WWE manager Bobby Heenan brought him in, and Roddy Piper gave him the name that stuck, Mr. Wonderful. In 1985, he stood in the main event of the first WrestleMania, where he teamed with Piper against Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. He took the pin after a plan to interfere fell apart on his own side. What came next made him a star. He split from Heenan, turned babyface, and teamed with Hulk Hogan. Then, in 1986, he turned on Hogan. The betrayal set off one of the biggest feuds of the decade, with a steel cage match on Saturday night's main event and a stadium show in Toronto called The Big Event. For a stretch, Orndorff was one of the few men the company was willing to put across from Hogan in a main event, night after night in arenas across the country. It was the highest point of his career, and the place where the rest of his life quietly began to turn. It was during this stretch that the injury happened. Orndorff hurt his neck, and the damage reached the nerves. He kept working the schedule while it went untreated, and over the months that followed, the muscles in his right arm began to waste away. The arm shrank. He talked about the moment years later in a sit-down interview.
Then I got hurt, I got my neck. That was the end of it.
He left the WWF in 1988. In 1990, he signed with World Championship Wrestling, where he won the WCW World Television Championship and formed a tag team called Pretty Wonderful with Paul Roma. The two of them held the WCW World Tag Team titles twice. He kept going into the late 1990s, but the neck and the arm never healed. And around the year 2000, they forced him out of full-time wrestling. In 2005, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. He still showed up now and then after that. A WrestleMania segment, a Raw celebration for Hogan, and in 2017, at the age of 67, he wrestled one last match, a six-man tag in Canada. Then the second half of the story took over. In 2011, Orndorff was diagnosed with throat cancer. He went onto a feeding tube and was in critical condition, and he came through it. In 2016, he became one of more than 50 retired wrestlers who sued WWE over concussions, head trauma, and CTE, a case the courts would later dismiss. In his final years, his health came apart. His family said he was living with dementia, and they tied it to the years of head trauma from football and wrestling. In May 2021, his son Travis posted a video of his father in a medical facility so that fans could see what the disease had done and asked people to share it for awareness. Paul Orndorff died on July 12, 2021, in Atlanta. He was 71. His wife Rhonda said the cause was dementia. The tributes came in right away. Hulk Hogan posted a message that called Orndorff his brother and thanked him for their matches. Jim Ross remembered him as a man's man. Ted DiBiase, who had worked with him back in the territories, called him a friend. WWE released a video package for Mr. Wonderful, but the tributes were only the surface. In shoot interviews recorded over the years, some while he was alive, some after he was gone, the wrestlers who came up alongside Orndorff began telling longer stories. Tony Atlas told one. Leon White, the man the world knew as Vader, told another. Hillbilly Jim told him. Other men who were backstage in WCW added their own versions of the same nights. Some of those stories are about how tough he was. Some are about his temper. Some are about the fights he got into behind the curtain. And some get into what the business did to his body and to his mind. That is the opening up the title is pointing to. Over the next 4 parts, we are going to take these accounts one at a time. And we start with the injury that every single one of them keeps circling back to. The damage he carried. Before the dementia, before the cancer ever came back to mind, before any camera caught him in a hospital bed, The tragedy of Paul Orndorff started with a single injury that he refused to let stop him, and that one decision shaped everything that came after. It happened in the mid-1980s at the height of the Hogan feud, when Orndorff was as big a draw as the company had. Something went wrong in his neck, and the pain shot down one side of his body and never fully left. Years later, sitting for an interview, he described the moment with no drama in his voice at all.
I got kicked underneath the chin, like that.
That single impact rewired the right side of his body in an instant, and he could feel it happening as it happened.
And when it did, my whole right side just went numb.
A doctor eventually x-rayed him, ordered a spinal tap, and handed him the kind of verdict that should end a wrestling career on the spot. The diagnosis was final, and Orndorff heard every word of it.
Sure enough, my neck was done. Yeah, done.
A neck that is done is a clear signal to walk away. Orndorff did the opposite, not once but again and again, climbing back into the ring and onto the operating table.
2 more times, I had 2 more surgeries, like an idiot. Like an idiot.
He called himself an idiot for it, and in the very same breath he turned the whole ordeal into a warning aimed at anyone listening who might be tempted to make the same mistake.
If you're hurt and you're hurt bad, listen to your doctor.
But the reason he never once took his own advice is the part that turns this from a story about stubbornness into a story about a man with no other way out.
But I had a family, I had bills, I did what I knew.
Wrestling was the only trade he had, so he kept handing his body over to it long after that body had started sending back the bill. And the bill was brutal. The thick, powerful heavyweight the fans had paid to see slowly came apart.
They treated me good, but I wasn't the same.
Not the same was an understatement. The number on the scale tells the story better than anything.
I mean, I wasn't 245, 250 pounds no more.
More than 40 pounds of muscle melted off his frame, and to a man whose entire act was built on looking carved out of granite, that loss was its own quiet grief.
You know, I was 220, and there's a big difference.
The cruelest, most visible scar of all was his right arm. The nerve damage in his neck slowly choked the life out of the muscle, and year after year the arm shriveled until it looked like it had been borrowed from a far smaller, far weaker man. This is the detail the other wrestlers could never stop returning to, because every one of them had seen it up close. Leon White, the giant the world knew as Vader, put it in the plainest words possible when he told his side of a now infamous backstage story.
Paul had a crippled right hand.
That was not a phrase chosen for drama. By Vader's account, the wasting ran the entire length of the limb, from the fingertips clear up to the shoulder.
His right hand was the same size as my wrist.
He held it up against his own enormous body, so the audience could grasp exactly how little of that arm was left.
All the way up to his shoulder.
And while that arm was quietly disappearing, something far deadlier was already circling him. In 2011, Orndorff was diagnosed with throat cancer, put on a feeding tube, and dragged to the very edge of his life before treatment hauled him back. Even the rivals who still had a bone to pick with him knew about it, and they raised it carefully. The way you mention something about a man you're still feuding with, but no longer wish any real harm.
I guess he's got throat cancer, is that right?
So before we ever reached the night he died, this is the true shape of his living difficulties. A neck that betrayed him in his prime, an arm that vanished an inch at a time, more than 40 pounds of muscle gone, and cancer stacked on top of all of it. He carried every ounce of that damage in public, in front of paying crowds, for years on end. And the surprising number of them, the moment a camera switched on, remembered something else first, his temper, and the nights it boiled over into a real fight. That is exactly where we are headed next, the temper that followed him. If you ask the men who shared a locker room with Paul Orndorff to describe him, the word that comes up before champion, before draw, before Mr. Wonderful, is one nobody ever put on a poster: temper. He was wired tight, quick to flare, and known for it long before his body started to fail. One of the most repeated stories about that temper belongs to Tony Atlas, and it begins with the smallest of favors, a ride.
We was giving Paul Orndorff a ride.
Atlas remembers a younger Orndorff who ran hot at the smallest spark, and a Paul who, in his telling, never really cooled down with the years.
Evidently, because he was very temperamental at his young days, he stayed temperamental.
The fuse this time was almost comically small. Riding from Columbus toward Dayton, Orndorff caught the smell of Atlas's food in the car and demanded the barbecue ribs be thrown out the window. Atlas, in a good mood, answered with a joke that Paul did not take as one.
I said, Paul, you throw them ribs out, I'll throw you out with them.
By the time the car pulled over, the joke was gone, and the fight was on.
He tried to sucker punch me.
What Orndorff may not have weighed in at that moment was Atlas's background. Long before the bodybuilding and the strongman gimmick, Tony Atlas had wrestled the real way, on a mat for points.
Well, I was a collegiate wrestler, not a football player like him. and I never felt the bite.
He only understood what had happened once the adrenaline drained, and he climbed back into the car.
My earlobe right here was hanging.
A doctor would keep Atlas overnight, warning him that a human bite is among the most dangerous wounds a person can take. And decades later, Atlas still bristles at how the story tends to get told, because in his version, the bite was not toughness. It was the move of a man who had already lost.
Paul could not whoop me on his best day.
He puts an even sharper point on it.
The only thing he could do against Tony Atlas is bite.
And just as blunt about how it ended.
Tony got Paul in a bear hug, and Paul bit his ear about off his earlobe.
In that second account, the bite is not the turning point of a war. It is the whole. This was a locker room that, by their own admission, ran hot in every sense. Adrenaline, ego, and the substances that fueled both.
Everybody was high-strung back then.
This
Was full of that sauce.
and the veterans who came up with him in the territories are not the least bit surprised by any of it. To them, this was simply who Paul became when his back hit a wall, a man who fought all the way to the bottom, with whatever he had.
Anyway, Paul is a half-ass savage.
They say it with something close to affection, the way old fighters talk about other old fighters, but it lands on the same truth Atlas keeps circling. Orndorff's temper was real, it was dangerous, and it left marks on people. The night his earlobe ended up in Tony Atlas's collar was not the last time that temper put him toe-to-toe with a man twice his size. The most famous time was still ahead of him, and it involved a 400-pound monster named Vader. That night has been argued over for almost 30 years. Let's untangle it. The night with Vader nobody agrees on. No single Paul Orndorff story has been retold, disputed, and relitigated more than the night he came to blows with Leon White, the man wrestling fans knew as Vader. It happened backstage at Center Stage in Atlanta during the WCW years, after Orndorff had stepped back from full-time wrestling to work as an agent, the man responsible for keeping the show running on time. And depending on who you ask, it is either the night a broken-down former star humbled a giant, or the night a giant let a sick man save face. The problem is that almost no two tellings line up. Start with the version that has lived loudest online, the one told by a man who says he watched it unfold. In his account, Vader was refusing to come out for an interview the production team badly needed. Orndorff was sent to fetch him, the two squared off, and Orndorff threw first.
And he bear-pawed him. Boom in the face.
According to this witness, Vader's opening shot landed, but it settled nothing. Orndorff answered, with the one arm that still worked, the good one, because the other was the withered limb we traced back in part 2.
Paul went over with his bad arm.
And then came the image that turned this story into folklore. Orndorff, smaller and sicker, dropping the giant and finishing him like a kicker splitting the uprights. But Vader spent the rest of his life telling it differently, and he had a grievance that is hard to wave off. To him, Orndorff built a small industry out of that one night, repeating it in interview after interview for decades.
You know what? Paul has made a living talking about this night.
To Vader, the fight was never about ego, and he spent years insisting the world had the cause backwards. By his account, the morning of that show began with a phone call from Eric Bischoff. He arrived back at the building late and exhausted, and by his telling, nobody had bothered to pass along the message that he would be delayed. When Orndorff confronted him about the missed interview, Vader says the agent did not simply scold him. He blocked his path and got in his face, so he struck first, a single slap that, by his own description, lifted Orndorff clean off his feet.
So I slapped him. His feet came off the ground.
That slap is the one piece Vader admits he got wrong. Throwing the first blow, he says, was a mistake, and the punches that came back at him are where his defense really begins. Because that defense rested on a single brutal fact. The hand Orndorff hit him with was less a fist than a casualty. It was the crippled right hand, the one that had wasted down to the size of a wrist.
And that's the hand he hit me with.
In Vader's telling, the famous beating barely registered. He says he let the punches come, partly out of guilt for having slapped Orndorff first, and that what landed felt like nothing.
So I let him hit me in the face, and it was nothing.
He had a reason it felt like nothing, and he never once softened it.
And it was that weak right hand.
So which is it? A broken man landing a real shot, or a giant taking a dive for his own pride? Here is where the story turns uncomfortable for Vader's side, because there was another man backstage that night. Someone who genuinely loved Leon White, who saw him the moment he came out of that room. And what he saw did not match the words, it was nothing.
His face looked like it exploded.
He describes swelling so severe that Vader spent the next stretch of the night with his head down in a bin of ice water, coming up only for air. And he says it plainly, with affection for Leon and no interest in embarrassing him.
But when you said he didn't hurt you, your face looked like it exploded.
And the fight cost Vader far more than a swollen reputation. In the aftermath, WCW suspended him, and he told him he could only return if he swallowed a punishing 6-month pay cut. That is the strange thing about all of these Orndorff stories. Everyone telling them seems to genuinely like the man. Vader, even while calling the legend overblown, kept circling back to the fact that Paul was sick, that he respected him, that none of it was personal anymore. The arguments are loud, but underneath them runs a quiet, consistent tenderness. Grown men who once beat each other bloody in parking lots and dressing rooms, now talking about a dying friend. Which brings us, at last, to the hardest part of the story, and to the real question buried inside that title. When it came to the worst of what happened to Paul Orndorff, did these legends ever truly open up, or did someone else have to do it for them? What they said and what they didn't. Everything we have covered so far, the ribs, the bite, the field goal, the swollen face has one thing in common. It is all backstage folklore. It is tough men telling tough stories about a tough guy. And it is exactly the sort of thing wrestlers love to open up about because it flatters nearly everyone involved, even the man who lost. But the title of this video does not promise stories about parking lot fights. It promises the truth about a tragic life. And to find that, you have to look at the part of Paul Orndorff's story the legends mostly did not tell. By the late 2010s, the damage we heard him describe in his own words had compounded into something far worse than a wasted arm. The neck injuries, the surgeries, the years of head trauma piled on top of a college football career, all of it caught up with him. His family said he developed dementia, and they tied it directly to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the brain disease known as CTE that has shadowed football players and wrestlers alike. CTE can only be confirmed after death, but the symptoms his family described, the memory loss, the confusion, the slow erasure of the man they knew, fit the pattern researchers have documented over and over in athletes with his history. He was far from the only one worried about it. Back in 2016, Orndorff had joined more than 50 other retired wrestlers in a lawsuit against WWE, arguing the company knew the long-term dangers of repeated head trauma and failed to protect its performers. The courts were not persuaded. The cases were dismissed on procedural grounds. The appeals fell short, and in 2021, the Supreme Court declined to take it up, shutting the door for good. Orndorff did not live to see that final ruling. And here is the most important fact in this entire story. The person who actually opened up about Paul Orndorff's tragic decline was not a legend at all. It was his son. In May 2021, Travis Orndorff posted a video of his father in a care facility, showing the world plainly and painfully what the disease had done to Mr. Wonderful. He did it deliberately, asking people to share it, because he wanted fans to understand the real price of the business his father had handed his body to. The video was hard to watch, and that was the point. The man on the screen bore little resemblance to the tanned, swaggering athlete on the old highlight reels, and Travis wanted that contrast to register. 2 months later, on July 12, 2021, Paul Orndorff died in Atlanta at the age of 71. His wife Rhonda confirmed the cause as dementia. Orndorff had seen the ending coming for a long time, and years earlier he had said so himself, in the same quiet voice he used for everything.
I was done. I was done.
When he passed, the tributes arrived just as you would expect. Hulk Hogan, his greatest rival and on-time partner, called him a brother and thanked him for forcing him to fight for every inch of their matches. Jim Ross remembered him as a man's man. Ted DiBiase grieved a friend from the territory days. WWE released a video package honoring his career. These tributes were warm, real, and deserved. But notice what they were: send-offs, celebrations of the performer. Almost none of them reached for the harder conversation: the concussions, the dementia, the question of what the work had quietly done to his brain. So let's answer the question the title asks head on. Did WWE legends finally open up about Paul Orndorff's tragic life? The honest answer is partly. They opened up about his toughness. They opened up about his temper, his fights, the wasted arm everyone could see. Even Vader, in the middle of defending himself, kept acknowledging how sick Paul had become. There is real candor in these shoot interviews, and real affection beneath the arguments. But the deepest tragedy, the brain disease, the slow disappearance of the man, the warning his death should sound for everyone still taking those bumps, was carried into the light mostly by his family, and by Paul himself, and not by the legends at all. Orndorff's story is not an isolated one, and that is exactly why it matters. He sat at the meeting point of two collision sports, a college football career feeding straight into more than 2 decades of professional wrestling, and the researchers who study brain trauma point to precisely this kind of cumulative exposure, the thousands of small impacts as much as the headline-grabbing ones, as what drives the disease. His generation worked in an era with almost no concussion protocols, performed hurt because the schedule left no other choice, and learned the full cost only decades later, once the symptoms arrived. Several of the men named alongside him in that 2016 lawsuit have since been diagnosed with CTE after their deaths. Orndorff's case helped force a hard conversation about wrestler health into the open, even as the courtroom doors swung shut on it. Maybe that is the most honest thing the wrestling business can offer about one of its own. The men who knew him will tell you he was wonderful in the ring, savage in a fight, and impossible to forget. The full weight of what it cost him to be all three, that part his son had to show us. Paul Orndorff gave the business everything he had, right down to the strength in his right arm, and in the end, the clarity of his mind. He deserved to be remembered for all of it, not only the good nights. And now, maybe he finally will be. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.